informs students about the situation in Palestine, for Palestinians inside and outside of Palestine. Our guest speaker today promises to give us eyewitness account on the situation in Palestine, and he's going to talk about the one-state solution, and that's pretty interesting. First time I've heard of it. So this event was sponsored by the Political Science Department, the Sociology and Anthropology Department, the Middle Eastern Studies Department, and our main co-sponsors are the North Leaders for Justice in Palestine and Israel. And basically, if you want to learn more about them, there's a table in the back. There's more literature on their organization. But also, I want to talk a bit more about one of their activities. So recently, they have the scholarship that funds a travel to Palestine, and one of their first persons to travel to Palestine is Soraya Dunger. So if you can stand up, Soraya. Yes, she's very eager. Oh, yeah. Okay, she's very eager to talk more about her travel to Palestine, so please contact her if you want to learn more. So there will be a question and answer session. Afterwards, you can buy Miko Peled's book, The Journalist's Son, and he's pleased to sign it afterwards. For now, I will yield the podium to Alison Schmidt, who is a member of NGP, and she will introduce our distinguished speaker. So, here.
I just want to make one little plug for our scholarship because it's called the Ruth Hansen Palestine Travel Scholarship. And many of you may know Ruth. She's been working on this issue for 40 years, almost as long as Palestine has been occupied. So, Miko Peled shouldn't be here tonight. What I mean is not that he skipped out on another obligation or that he was surprised when his plane landed in Minneapolis today. What I mean is that it defies logic that he is here. Miko grew up in a prominent Zionist family. His grandfather signed Israel's Declaration of Independence. His father fought in the 1948 war and served as a general in the 1967 war. During his own military service, Miko earned the coveted Red Beret of Israel's Special Forces. In 1997, he experienced the unimaginable pain of losing a young niece in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. Who could blame him if he had become bitter and vengeful? And indeed, many Israelis have. But instead, he is here tonight to share a message of hope, born out of grief, earnest inquiry, and personal courage. Born and raised in Jerusalem, Miko has lived in Southern California with his family since 1987, and he is now a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen. A sixth-degree black belt in karate, he founded and led a martial arts school for 23 years until dedicating himself last year to writing, speaking, and activism on the Israel-Palestine issue. This work takes him to universities, conferences, and media outlets around the world. When he is in his native land, you'll find him visiting friends and family, including his mother Zika, in Jerusalem. In Palestine, you may find him getting arrested at peaceful demonstrations against the apartheid wall or teaching karate to children in a Palestinian refugee camp. Through deeply moving stories, revealing recollections from his life, and extensive research, Miko's book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, offers a hopeful vision of a single state in which Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equality and peace. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Alice Walker writes in her foreword to the book, "There are few books on the Palestine-Israel issue that seem as hopeful to me as this one." Israeli historian Ilan Pappé says, "Out of personal pain and sober reflection on the past comes this powerful narrative of transformation, empowerment, and commitment. It is the personal story that brings home forcefully how one liberates oneself from oppressive ideologies without losing one's identity, family, and humanity." Miko's story is a must-read for anyone who has not lost hope that one day peace and justice will prevail in Israel and Palestine. In addition to his conviction that a just resolution is possible, Miko's story is hopeful in another way. Those of us who are advocates for this or any justice cause can become discouraged. We do our small part, we host lectures, we write letters, we hold educational events, we donate to advocacy groups, we speak for peace while the world prepares for war. Yet injustice persists, and we wonder if we are wasting our time. If only we could devise a huge campaign that would instantly end the crisis. But while it was tragedy that propelled Miko into action, it was small things, family conversations, personal encounters, probing questions, daily life, that prepared him to respond to tragedy, not with revenge, but with a broken heart and an open mind. In a similar way, Miko's story will break your heart and open your minds to the possibilities for solving the most urgent and shameful human rights tragedy of our time. How grateful we can be that all those things, big and small, bring him here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Miko Peled.
Thank you, Allison, for that very gracious introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Excuse me. And I want to thank all the groups collectively that came together to make this happen. People often ask me, how is it that I'm hopeful? And how can you be anything but hopeful when you see so many people of so many different ages, so many different backgrounds come together on this issue? And it doesn't only happen here, it happens across the United States and Canada and of course other parts of the world. So, you know, seeing the people, the quality of people, people's commitment to this issue is one of the reasons why I'm so hopeful. How many people here are actually from Israel or Palestine? Anybody? I see a show of hands. You? Okay. How many people here have relatives there? A few more. Okay. Who's actually been there? All right, cool. Is there anyone who can't find it on a map? I ask because, you know, when you look at a map, it's interesting. First of all, some people think that there's an Israel and a Palestine. So they look for one and they find the other. But the reality is, of course, that Israel and Palestine is the exact same place. These are two names for the same country. So there's not like an Israel and a Palestine. And besides, when you look at a map, you have to look very, very carefully to find it. Because when you look at the region, you see Africa, you see the Arabian Peninsula, you see all these big countries. And the only country that you really can't see is Israel-Palestine, because the name never fits. The name actually usually covers Cyprus on the Mediterranean, because it doesn't fit that little sliver of land on the coast of the Mediterranean. So, and here we are spending all our time and effort and so on talking about that little sliver of land. But like I said earlier, even though I fully realize, and I think you will too at the end of my talk, just how grim and severe the situation is on the ground. Thank you. I think that I'm very hopeful because of this, what somebody else, not me, termed the global intifada that's taking place, this global resistance to Israel. This commitment by people of all faiths, all backgrounds, all ages, particularly I would say over the last 5-6 years here in this country, although some people have been working on this much longer. But particularly over the last 5-6 years, there's been a huge surge on this issue. And a huge commitment made by students on campuses, like here on this campus, church groups, civic organizations that are committed to learning more about the plight of the Palestinian issue, of the plight of the Palestinians, and understanding how to resolve this issue. And probably, and I have a great deal of respect for anyone that puts themselves out and talks about this and tries to resolve this and educates people on this. I have to say, though, that seeing students on campus do this over and over again on so many campuses all around the country all over North America, I should say, is particularly heartwarming. And I always make a point of saying this. These young kids, you know, they're somewhere between 19 and 22 usually. They're fully committed to this issue. They organize events. They build walls on campus. They bring speakers. They have to fight an administration that usually is not interested in their presence. They have to fight pro-Israeli groups who are in their face all the time, and they do it very well, and they succeed, and they educate thousands and thousands of people every single year. And when Palestine is free and democratic, as I believe it will be, and sooner than most people think, all of us and everyone that's involved in this issue, but I think particularly these young students, will be able to say with pride that they had a great deal to do with bringing that about. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that you guys are changing the world. And when you're older and your kids ask you, where were you on this issue? Or your grandkids will ask you, and they will ask, where were you on this issue? You will be able to say with pride exactly where you stood, that you stood for Palestine, you stood for justice, and you stood for peace. The people on the other side will have to either deny who they supported, or will have to face with shame, or the shame that they supported the wrong side on this issue. Now, I think it goes without saying, or if you didn't understand it yet, my presentation is clearly unbalanced. My presentation is clearly one-sided. If you heard the introduction, you probably can understand why. You know, it's deeply personal besides being an important issue, but for me it's also deeply personal, and I don't believe that there is a balanced presentation out there on this issue, because it's not a balanced issue, and anybody who takes the time to actually talk about it probably has a very strong point of view one way or the other. I want to start today with a couple of things that seem to make this issue particularly difficult to understand, or particularly difficult to sift through. There's so much information that supports both sides of the issue. There's so many, you'll have one book that says this and another book that says exactly the opposite. And how do you work through this? And I think probably one of the biggest misconceptions on this issue is the issue of the Holocaust. Two statements that are made about the Holocaust and how it relates to Palestine. One is that Jewish people need a strong state of Israel because that is the only thing that stands between Jews and another Holocaust. Another statement that is made is, how can people who have suffered so much now turn around and do this to another people? And both of these statements are not true. After World War II, there were about 2 million Jewish refugees living in Europe in internment camps. These were the survivors, the actual survivors of the Holocaust. Less than 200,000 actually immigrated to Israel. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors chose to either stay in Europe, even go back to Germany and reclaim their identity as Germans, or come to America, a lot of places where they didn't really want them, but they insisted, and that's where they went. Very few actually went to Palestine and to Israel, immigrated to Israel. And many of those who did immigrate to Israel end up leaving and returning to Europe or coming to America. So I would say that is a very powerful statement. It's Jewish people themselves saying, look, we don't want this, we don't need this. It's also true then that it's not fair, or it's wrong, to implicate Holocaust survivors with the crimes of Israel and the crimes of Zionism against the Palestinians. These are not the same people. These happen to be Jewish people, and these happen to be Jewish people, but they are not the same people. And the state of Israel, although has cynically used the Holocaust to justify a lot of what it does, but it's not true. It's not true that these are the same people, and again, it's unfair to implicate Holocaust survivors with the terrible crimes of the state of Israel. So that's one issue that's out there, that's often misunderstood. Another part of that, or maybe an extension of that, is that if we criticize the state of Israel, then it's anti-Semitic and racist. Which is really absurd, because for many reasons. First of all, many Jews have rejected the state of Israel from the very beginning, or opposed the state of Israel to varying degrees, always. So this has been part of reality. So what are all these Jews also anti-Semitic? Not to mention the fact that most Jews never have and probably never will live in Israel. But besides that, the actual idea that if you criticize the state of Israel, you're anti-Semitic and racist is interesting when we look at the details. So what does that mean when you support the state of Israel? What is the term that you would use to describe someone who supports a state that has thousands of political prisoners, that deprives half of the population, the non-Jewish population, of water, that has different laws for Jews and non-Jews, that on a regular basis, as a matter of policy, kills innocent civilians who are Palestinians? And this has been going on for 65, 66 years. What do you call someone who supports that? So opposing this is somehow anti-Semitic and racism, and supporting this is good for anyone? For Jews? It's a statement that's so absurd and really quite despicable. And what happened, the reality that exists today, because this goes all the way to the top from the Israeli prime minister and major Jewish leaders and so on who make this claim. And many people who are not Jewish are afraid to speak up because nobody wants to be called a racist. And there's this impression out there that that it's wrong to criticize Israel because of this. And I think it's important to get over that and continue the conversation. So if this is anti-Semitic, what is this? What does it mean to support all this? And then, of course, there's this absurd argument that says, well, those people over there, they've been killing each other forever. So it's really pointless. It's hopeless. They've been killing each other for thousands of years, for hundreds of years, or whatever the case may be, which, of course, isn't true. But this is code for telling people not to get involved. It's code for telling people this is beyond you. Don't get into the complexities. Let's keep it simple. Good guys, bad guys. The good guys are winning. Leave it alone. And that's a very dangerous thing because it's not a tsunami. This is a problem that was created by people and will be resolved by people. And if people are persuaded not to get involved, this will never be resolved. And so I urge you to not accept that and to get involved and to delve into the complexities and stay away from trying to keep it simple. Because it's only through the complexities and a good understanding of the complexities that we can resolve this. You want to go ahead and scroll down? There, perfect. So people always, if we want to talk about the beginnings of the conflict, it's a good, I would say a good time, a good day to look at is precisely the 29th of November, 1947. Now this is a map of Palestine, and it's particularly a map of what's called the Partition Resolution. On the 29th of November, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted and passed a resolution that called for the partition of Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. So we had Jews who claimed the land, we had Arabs who claimed the land. The UN came and said, well, we'll give each one a piece and all will be well. Once again, trying to simplify a complex reality. Now, what's interesting about that is this. In 1947, there were only about 500,000 Jews living in Palestine. This was mainly the generation of my grandparents who immigrated there, and my parents who were born there, first generation born there. The Palestinian community numbered close to 1.5 million people, and these were the natives of the land. These were the Palestinian Arabs. Yet in the United Nations resolution, the larger portion of the land was given to the smaller community. And the smaller portion of the land, the yellowish tan side portion, was given to the larger Palestinian community. Now, of course, nobody ever discussed this with the Palestinians, but to this day you hear people say, well, this whole conflict, it's really the Palestinians' fault because they rejected this plan. And you have to wonder, did anybody expect that the Palestinians would welcome this plan? That the United Nations would come, slice off the larger portion of your country and give it to a community of people who literally just came off the boat and is far smaller. Why would they have accepted it? And then from this point on, we have two opposing narratives. It's not that the two narratives, differ in detail or nuance. We have two histories that are diametrically opposed. And the problem with that is, particularly if we look for balance, is that we can't find balance. If you have two histories that are diametrically opposed, only one of them can be true. Now, the story that I learned, and the story that people generally accept in the West and study in the West, is that after the Arabs rejected this plan and rejected the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, they began a massive assault against the Jewish community in Palestine, intending to destroy them and kill them. And because the small Jewish community was stronger and wiser and better prepared and perhaps culturally more advanced somehow, they were able to defeat the Arabs and establish a Jewish state once again in the land of Israel, their ancient homeland, after 2,000 years. And these same Jews that we know, or as some people believe, are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. So they're the descendants of King David, who defeated Goliath. And they're the descendants of the Maccabees, who defeated great empires. And now here they are back, and they've defeated the Arabs. So there's a narrative here that's almost biblical. And who would want to refute such a wonderful story? Who would want to try to poke holes at it? It's a perfect story. It's heroic, it's biblical, it's romantic, good guys, bad guys, end of story. Hopefully, as we mature, we do delve into complexities. And we do take a few pokes at the perfect stories that we learn as children. And when we do this on this particular story, what we find out is something very interesting. Again, we had the smaller Jewish community and the larger Palestinian community, two communities that were expecting and hoping to be recognized as states. But there was one thing in which the Zionist Jewish community in Palestine invested in heavily, and the Palestinians did not. An armed militia. By 1947, the Zionist militia, in which my father was an officer, numbered close to 40,000 well-trained armed men. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So one has to wonder, who are these Arabs that attacked in 1947? We know other Arab armies intervened later on, 6-7 months later. But in 1947, who are these Arabs that attacked? And what did they attack with? And it turns out that they didn't attack. It turned out that as soon as the United Nations accepted this resolution and gave its stamp to the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Zionist militias began a massive attack in what today would be called terrorism and ethnic cleansing. It was a 12-month cruel terrorist attack with the intention of ethnically cleansing the land of its native population. Within 12 months, these terror attacks ended up with the conquest almost of the entire country. 80% of the country was conquered. Hundreds and hundreds of towns, Palestinian towns and cities, were destroyed. And close to 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. And the state of Israel was established on the ashes of Palestine. Now, it's not so heroic, it's not so romantic, but the pieces fit the puzzle. We can now understand what took place and how. Could you go ahead and scroll down? Now, there is a claim that is made quite often that, well, maybe perhaps there was a war, maybe perhaps they kicked a few people out, but there really was nothing there. There was no Palestine. And what little Palestine there was, they were poor farmers and nomads, they had no culture, they were uncivilized, and any progress that came to that country was brought as a result of the Zionist immigration, the Jewish immigration. So let's take a look at one example. This is a picture of the city of Jaffa before 1948. It was a major Arab city on the coast of the Mediterranean. It was a city of over 100,000 people. It had a rich business life, political life, trade unions. Several newspapers were printed in Jaffa. It had movie theaters and concert halls. Some of the biggest names in the Arab world would perform in Jaffa. It had boulevards. That boulevard, by the way, is still there. It was a major Arab city. And in a matter of 2 weeks in 1948, this city was reduced from over 100,000 people to less than 4,000 people, concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wire surrounding it and Israeli guards. And I think this is important to understand. People often will say, well, we need to put the past behind us. This was a long time ago. The Palestinians need to forget. And try to reduce the whole issue of Palestine into the West Bank and Gaza, two very small areas within Palestine. But that is not only wrong, it's impossible to do. The city of Jaffa was a large Arab city with a small Jewish neighborhood. Can you go ahead and And do the next one. Today, on the ashes of Jaffa sits the city of Tel Aviv. And this picture is almost exactly from the same angle. A large Israeli city with a small, oppressed, neglected Palestinian community. And that small, oppressed, neglected Palestinian community is very similar to other Palestinian communities within the state of Israel. In other words, these are Israeli citizens. And you could say forget the past if the past really was behind us. But the process didn't end. The oppression of Palestinians, even within Israel, even of that are Israeli citizens, still goes on. The neglect still goes on. So you can't talk about the past if the past continues to exist today, if the process hasn't ended. Can you go ahead? And the result, or one of the results of this horrific act that took place in 1948, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe, is the fact that today we have over 4 million Palestinians living in refugee camps. Now, this picture I took in November. You're not going to find Israeli children looking like this. You're only going to find Palestinian children looking like this. Now, this refugee camp, as many others, is quite often no more than an hour or 2 hours drive from major modern cities where, like I said, you wouldn't dream of seeing Israeli children like this. But they have no access to running water or electricity or a proper sewage system or proper medical care or proper nutrition. Now, this is not in some remote hilltop in Afghanistan. This is, like I said, an hour, maybe 2 hours drive from the very cities from which their grandparents were forced to exile, and where you wouldn't dream of finding kids that don't have access to water, Israeli kids. They don't have access to water or proper medical care, or who look like this, who have to live like this. The Nakba, or the catastrophe, didn't happen in 1948. It began in 1948. It goes on to this day because it's being allowed to go on to this day. It's shameful. It's inexcusable that under our watch, today, an hour's drive, 2 hours drive from major modern cities, major health medical centers, Palestinian children still have to live like this. And they have to live like this because they're not allowed to participate in what Israel has created within itself. And this, like I said, goes on to this day, every day. So when people ask Palestinians to forget the past and look into the future, we need to remember this picture and say, we can forget the past. They can forget the past. The past will be forgotten when this process ends, and it has not ended yet. So the Nakba, the catastrophe, is not something of the past. It's very much part of the present. Whether it's inside Israel, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in Jaffa, in the Negev Desert, in the Galilee, in refugee camps all around the country. It's a process that still goes on. And as I said, this is under our watch every single day, with billions and billions of dollars coming from the pockets of everyone here. Can you go ahead? Now, my book goes in and out of my own personal family history and into the reality, the relations between the two nations. And like you heard earlier, my family history is very much tied into the creation of the State of Israel. Now, there's a story. This is a picture of my mother when she was young. She was 22 or 23 here. She's 87 now. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives in Jerusalem. And there was a story that she told me many, many times as I was growing up. I mentioned it in the book. And we still talk about it to this day. And it's something that happened to her in 1948. Now, like I said, she was born and raised in Jerusalem. And when I say Jerusalem, I don't mean the old city of Jerusalem. I mean the neighborhoods that were built outside in what later on became the Israeli part of the city. And these were neighborhoods that, by the way, are still there. The homes are still there. These are beautiful homes, beautiful neighborhoods. And in 1948, when the Zionist militia came, they took these neighborhoods, they forced the residents to leave, and these homes were made available to Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of these homes. She was living in a small apartment with her parents, and she was already a mother herself. My father was fighting for the Zionist cause. And she was offered one of these homes, and she refused to take one. And her comment always is, when she talks about it throughout my whole life, with the same emotion, she says it with the same emotion. And her reaction is, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How could I possibly move into the home of a family that now has to live in exile? And then she goes on to describe the looting. And she said, how could they have done it, these soldiers, Israeli soldiers? Because these are well-to-do neighborhoods and well-to-do homes, and because she grew up in that city, she knew the families and she knew the people. And she would describe the truckloads full of furniture and rugs. And you may have seen, there was a very good documentary about books that were stolen. Apparently, the Zionist militias had a unit of librarians that followed the troops and would go in house after house and steal books. That's just how organized they were. And there's a very good documentary about that. And so she would describe all this, and still does with great shame. How could we as a people, how could these people have done this? Now, this is an important story. It's a good story. We all would hope that we would have reacted like she, although most people didn't. But there was something about this story that was particularly troubling to me my entire life. And it wasn't until I was actually working on the book and talking to her about this over and over again that I understood what it was. Her story contradicts the national narrative. Because the national narrative, the Zionist narrative, is perfect. It's foolproof. And she's presenting a moral dilemma in a story that has no moral dilemmas, that is morally perfect. Because the narrative is, the country was ours, all of it. And we deserved all of it, but we agreed to the partition. Then they attacked us, they rejected it and attacked us, and we won. Then we asked them to stay, and they left. We asked the Palestinians to stay, and they left. So if all this is true, where's the moral dilemma in taking the home? People left, there's an empty home, there's a family that could use a home. Where's the moral dilemma? The Zionist story, the Zionist narrative is perfect, yet my mother was poking a hole in it. She was contradicting this national narrative by presenting this moral dilemma. In fact, the Zionist story is so perfect that even when they do talk about atrocities, such as the massacre of Deir Yassin was a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And when the Zionist forces came, the village surrendered. And the forces came in and committed a terrible massacre anyway. And Israeli children learn about this in school. I remember learning about it in school, and I know they still do. And the way it's taught is very interesting. So we know it was a terrible thing. We know that women and children were killed and how wrong that is. But the end of the story tells us that as a result of this massacre, hundreds of thousands of Arabs fled. And that allowed us to create a Jewish majority. And there is nothing more important than us creating a Jewish majority. So even though this is a terrible story, there's a happy ending for us. So even though there was an atrocity and there was a massacre, the story is morally perfect because it worked out for the best. And yet, here she was presenting this moral dilemma. Go ahead. Now, between 1948 and 1967, this was the map. Israel included almost all of Palestine, with the exception of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In 1967, the opportunity presented itself, and Israel took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, along with the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula. I won't get into the details of the war, although I do talk about it at length in my book. And the story that we hear about this war, once again, is that Israel was under an existential threat. In other words, Arab armies were lined up and prepared to destroy the state of Israel. And once again, miraculously, these descendants of King David and the Maccabees defeated the Arab armies. Turns out, looking at documents from the Israeli army archives themselves, that disprove this claim. But I won't get into that. Go ahead and the next slide. And my father was a general by then. That's his picture. And many of the young officers of 1948 who remained in the military were generals by 1967. They were very young generals. And again, when we look at documents throughout the years leading up to the war, we see that the West Bank and the Golan Heights were two areas that the Israeli military had wanted to take for a very long time. Both of them are strategically placed. They have a lot of water. And within the West Bank lies, the heartland of biblical Israel and the old city of Jerusalem. Now, when several interesting things happened immediately after the war. On a personal level, my father stood up as a general at the end of the war in the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command. And he made a very interesting statement. He said, "We now have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians. We conquered all this land, we've established ourselves, we're strong, we defeated all these armies. At the same time, there's still another nation here with whom we share the land. if we need to allow them to establish their own state in the West Bank and Gaza. That will allow us to make peace with this state and then move on and make peace with the other Arab armies. With the other Arab states. As he was saying these very words, the Israeli army, one of the first orders the Israeli army ever made in regards to the land was that the water in the West Bank is the property of the state of Israel. Now, all this is still 1967, 1968. This is very early after the war. And Israeli bulldozers began destroying cities and towns and neighborhoods of Palestinians, forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians again into exile, and building for Israeli Jews only, which is exactly what they did after 1948. You want to go ahead and pass the next slide? This next slide is the victory picture. This is the Israeli High Command with the Israeli President Shazar. And the Israeli High Command were celebrating. They were congratulating themselves for what they called finishing the job. Which job did they finish? It was a job that they felt was incomplete in 1948, and that is the conquest of the land, conquering the entire country. Go ahead, next one. And in reality, what they did was this. After the war of 1967, all of Palestine was erased off the map. Israel took its place. And in reality, a single state, binational state, was established over the entire country. They call it a Jewish state, even though today about half the population is not Jewish. At that time, it wasn't half the population, but it was a large minority. It was not Jewish. They call it a democracy, but when the half of the population isn't counted, then it's not a democracy either. But it's a state on the entire country. It's a single state governed by the state of Israel with exclusive rights for Jewish people. And that's exactly what they created after 1967. And like I said, immediately after those territories were taken, the water was claimed as belonging to the state of Israel. And what Israel did in other parts of Palestine 20 years earlier, they did again, which is to destroy Palestinian towns and build for Israeli Jews only. So today when people talk about the possibility of an Israeli government allowing the Palestinians to establish a state on that land, it's a complete misunderstanding and misreading of what the state of Israel is all about and what Zionism is all about. The state of Israel and the Zionist ideology claim that this country belongs to the Jews. It's the land of Israel. End of story. We will build on it, we will take it, we will live there, and anybody else is going to have to just deal with it. There is no possibility that an Israeli government will ever allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza, or in any other part of this country. But this reality was created by Israel and by design. In other words, taking of the West Bank and integrating it into the rest of the country was something that was done by design by Israel. Yet, go ahead and do the next one, please. Yet we hear the claim that Israel wants peace. Now, my father retired a year after the war from the military, and he continued to advocate these ideas that Palestinian rights of self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza needs to be respected, and the rights of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens need to be respected as well, and they need to have equal rights. Two things that have not happened yet. Neither one of these has been accomplished. Now, in mid-1970s, he and several other Israelis who shared his views created an organization that was dedicated to this purpose, to promoting these ideas. And no sooner did they announce the creation of their organization, they were contacted by official members of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the organization that represented Palestinians, Yasser Arafat's top people. They contacted them in order to begin some kind of a dialogue to see if this two-state idea can work and how it might be able to work. They would meet in Europe, they would meet in North Africa. The meetings at first were quiet and secret. And this is when this idea of the two-state solution, that the Palestinians would have their own state in the West Bank and Gaza, was being formulated. Now, on the Palestinian side, these were officials of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. On the Israeli side, these were renegades. People like my father and others who used to hold high position, were highly respected, but really had no political influence at all. Whenever they would come back from these meetings, my father would always go and brief the prime minister. So the Israeli government was fully aware, they knew what was going on, and they wanted nothing to do with it. This was the 70s. In 1983, they had a meeting, a very highly publicized meeting with Yasser Arafat in Tunis. Once again, Israel wanted nothing to do with it. Not only did they want nothing to do with it, but in a move that was initiated by Shimon Peres himself, Mr. Nobel Peace Prize, the Knesset passed a law that made these meetings illegal. It was illegal to meet with members of the PLO. My father and the others said, you know what, arrest us, we're not going to stop. And then suddenly, in 1993, we had the Oslo Peace Accords. Suddenly in 1993, we had Yitzhak Rabin, of all people, Yitzhak Rabin, this war horse with a record of war crimes that goes from here to I don't know where. He was the one who signed the peace deal, the Oslo Peace Accords with Yasser Arafat, with Bill Clinton in the midst on the White House lawn. This was all a very happy occasion. Many people really thought that something is changing. Apartheid had fallen, Soviet Union was falling apart, new democracies were emerging, and maybe peace was coming to Palestine. But the truth of the matter is that by 1993, there was no longer a chance for a Palestinian state to be established. By 1993, the West Bank was fully integrated into Israel through the building of cities and towns, what they like to call settlements, as though they're small little villages, you know. They invested billions of dollars in building these cities and towns and industry and so forth, and shopping malls and highways and so forth. The purpose of Oslo was not to bring the Palestinians and make peace. The purpose of Oslo was to bring in the Palestinians to surrender, which is why it failed. Oslo was supposed to bring us to an agreement within 5 years. That was 93. It would have been a final agreement by 1998. In the year 2000, in the summer of the year 2000, Bill Clinton, on his way out of office, decided to bring the parties to Camp David to try to close the deal. They sat there for days and days. They sat there about 2 weeks. They came out, nothing happened. There was no deal. And when Bill Clinton came out of Camp David, he said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. Basically laying the blame for the failure on the Palestinians, saying that Yasser Arafat was not willing to make concessions. This was the claim, and this is the claim that we hear to this day, that the Palestinians are not willing to make concessions. Now, when Yasser Arafat, as representative of the Palestinian people, accepted the two-state solution as a principle for a peace agreement, he gave up almost 80% of Palestine. He gave up the right of the Palestinian refugees to ever return to that part of Palestine. He recognized the state that destroyed Palestine and was willing to make peace with that very state. But he was accused of not making concessions, because that wasn't enough. They wanted surrender. They wanted the Palestinians to agree to small little areas within the West Bank, determined by Israel, to be governed with very limited autonomy that would be determined by Israel and would be led by Palestinian leadership that was determined by Israel. In other words, complete surrender. And to that, Yasser Arafat wasn't willing to sign. That he was not willing to agree. And for that, he was vilified, called a terrorist. 4 years later, he died in Ramallah with Israeli tanks surrounding his office in Ramallah. While Yasser Arafat, for the 30 years leading up to his death, from the mid-1970s till 2004, was the most consistent voice for peace in the Middle East. He agreed to the principle of peace based on a two-state solution, where the Palestinian state would include the West Bank with no Israeli settlements, no Israeli cities or towns, the Gaza Strip, and Arab East Jerusalem, or what used to be Arab East Jerusalem, as its capital. In other words, about 22% of historic Palestine. And for that, he was willing to negotiate and make peace, but not anything less than that. And because he did not agree to less than that, he was vilified. Israel, on the other hand, has made absolutely no sign that it has any interest in peace with the Palestinians. In fact, quite the opposite. The building and the continuous building of cities and towns and the full integration of the West Bank into Israel, and claims made by Israeli politicians, Israeli commanders, Israeli soldiers, that there is no difference between this city in the West Bank and that city in the rest of Israel. These are claims that are being made and have been made for decades by Israelis themselves. That there is no difference between Ariel and Tel Aviv. There's no difference between Netzarim, which used to exist in Gaza and Jerusalem or Haifa or whatever. That it's all one country, it all belongs to the Jews, and that's the end of the story. Israel has absolutely done everything it possibly could to sabotage efforts to bring peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Can you go ahead to the next one, please? A little more. Bring it down. No, the other way. Perfect. Thank you. Now we have the question of terrorism and Palestinian resistance. Israel has thousands of political prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, that it holds in Israeli jails and has done for decades. Israel calls them terrorists, even though the vast majority of the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails have not been charged with acts of violence. The vast majority of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, have not been charged with acts of violence. Only a small minority have been. And this is taken into account, this is even by the low bar of the Israeli judicial system when it comes to judging Palestinians. And then you have hundreds of Palestinians who have not been charged with anything at all. In other words, even the low bar of the Israeli judicial system found nothing with which to charge them, yet they are in prison anyway for months and years. Men, women, and minors in what they call administrative detention. And Israel calls terrorists even though there were no charges of violence brought against most of them. And then we have a United Nations resolution that really, more than anything, represents the fact that the world community recognizes the rights of people to resist. We recognize the people who are oppressed to resist. And you can read it for yourself, the struggle of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, three things that characterize the state of Israel, almost by its own definition. So resistance to that by people for the implementation of their right to self-determination and independence is legitimate and in full accordance with the principle of international law. International law and the world community recognizes the rights of people to resist. And what's interesting about the Palestinian resistance, and is reflected in the prison population, is that the vast majority of the Palestinian resistance has been unarmed, nonviolent resistance as a principle. Only a small portion of Palestinian resistance has been armed and violent, but of course it's a lot more dramatic, so it gets all the news. I remember my father once being interviewed, of course as a retired general, and he was asked, how can you possibly make peace with Palestinians, with terrorists? How can you talk to terrorists? And he said, well, terrorism is a terrible thing, of course. At the same time, when a small nation is being overpowered by a larger power, occupied by a larger power, quite often terrorism is the only means at their disposal. If Israel doesn't like the rockets coming out of Gaza, Israel knows what to do. You can lift the siege on Gaza and allow the people in Gaza to live as normal human beings. The power to end the resistance is in the hands of the oppressor. Yet we always blame the oppressed. We always blame the victim for daring to raise their head and resist. And this is in a state that calls itself a democracy and is being hailed as the only democracy in the Middle East. You go ahead and... And then, of course, we have the victims of the violence, who are almost always innocent victims. In my own family's story, it was my sister's little girl, Smadar, who was 13 years old, and she was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. It was September the 4th, 1997. She was going downtown Jerusalem to buy a few things with some friends. Two young Palestinians blew themselves up, killed themselves, of course, killed Smadar and several other Israelis. Now, whenever there's an attack, of course, it's always big news in Israel. This was bigger news because one of the victims was the granddaughter of Miko Peled, a famous general who would later on became an advocate for Palestinian rights. My father passed away 2 years before that. But this was very big news. I was living in the US at the time, so I took the first plane home. And when I reached my sister's apartment in Jerusalem, it was already packed with reporters. You can only imagine. And packed with people who came to express their sorrow, both Palestinians and Israelis. And how do you even begin to think or feel? I mean, when something so horrible happens, you really don't know what to think or feel. It's beyond anything that we were supposed to feel or think, as human beings. A child being killed like that. But, the questions were being asked: who's responsible, and how do we get them, and how many do we kill, and what about retaliation, and so forth. And after the funeral, my sister came out to see everybody and talk to everybody, and she began answering questions. And the first thing she said was, in terms of retaliation and revenge, She said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. The idea of killing people in response to somebody's death, particularly a child, is not only reprehensible, but absurd. What real mother would want to see another mother go through such grief? And she quoted a famous line from a Hebrew poet, Bialik, who wrote that even the devil himself couldn't invent vengeance that's appropriate for the death of a child. And in terms of who's responsible, she said, both she and her husband directly said, they hold the Israeli government directly responsible for their daughter's death. Because when you take away people's land and destroy their homes, take away their water, throw their fathers in jail when they resist, and shoot their younger brothers and sisters in school where they are defenseless, what exactly do we expect as a society? What do we expect with such oppression? And in terms, people often talk about this in terms of, forgiveness and so forth. There is no room for forgiveness. There's room for justice. When Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister then as well, and other Israeli commanders and generals who actually are the ones who are responsible for the oppression of the Palestinians and the killing of Palestinian civilians, sit in trial and face justice, then we can talk about forgiveness. But the line between her death and their policies is a direct line. And their ideologies is a direct line. And once they face justice and they sit in a defendant's chair in The Hague, then we can talk about moving on beyond that. But I think this is, my sister talks about a great deal. Now, in terms of what, people listening and responding to what she said, now this was even bigger news, because now we have this bereaved Israeli mother who had just buried her daughter, and she changed everything up. She turned the whole world upside down. She's saying that we know that the Israelis are victims and the Palestinians are terrorists. We know that Israelis want peace and Palestinians are, don't want peace, unreliable. And here she is standing there, and both she and her husband and their 3 boys have become activists and talk about this issue a great deal. In my case, I went back to the US, and you have to try to pick up where you left off. And even though in terms of time, there wasn't a lot of time that lapsed behind, but this was something that it's hard to describe in words, and it's hard to pick up where you left off. My good fortune was that in San Diego, I met and began attending a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group. And I began attending these meetings, and this was the first time I ever met Palestinians. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, in a mixed city. But it's a very segregated city. It's a completely, really racist city. So as an Israeli, you never meet Palestinians. So this was the first time I ever met Palestinians. In fact, the chapter in the book that talks about it begins with the lines, "My journey into Palestine began in San Diego. I was 39 years old." But beyond meeting them for the first time, this was the first opportunity I ever had to actually be with Palestinians in one place, and we were completely equal. In other words, the laws that applied to me and the laws that applied to their lives were the same laws. The amounts of water that I was given and the amounts of water that they were given were the exact same amounts of water. They had no curfews, no checkpoints, no permits that they needed to cross. We would meet, we would talk, and we would leave. And let me tell you something. This is a very powerful thing. In fact, there would be many Israelis who would come to these meetings, sit with the Palestinians, and just storm out. And later on asking me, how do you sit with these extremists? Palestinians who dared to confront the Israeli narrative. And all we would do, and I would say, what extremists? We're all here to figure this out. What we would do is everybody would sit and tell their story. It's dialogue. This was not a debate. This was a dialogue. Everybody would sit and just tell their story. And very graciously and very generously, I would say, this Palestinian community in San Diego took me through this very difficult process of, first of all, realizing that there's another story, and that's okay. Even though it's diametrically opposed to my story, it's okay. And then going through another difficult and very dangerous, I would say, process where the fear leaves and trust takes its place. And when the fear leaves and trust takes its place, it's a very, very dangerous process because the walls and the barriers begin to fall. And instead of enemies, you see people. And then I began to realize that there's a whole other country that I was never familiar with, even though I grew up there, and it's called Palestine. There's an entire people I never met, even though they were my next door neighbors, almost literally, and these are the Palestinians. And there's an entire narrative, an entire culture with which I was not familiar, even though it was right next door to me, and this is Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian culture. And then, through my own travels, I would go to Palestinian towns, I'd visit Palestinian communities, I got myself involved, and I realized that out of the two stories that exist, only one was true, and it wasn't the story that I was raised upon. It's their story. And let me tell you, it's like having your arm sawed off very slowly without anesthesia, especially coming with this whole, very patriotic background from which I came. Go ahead, please. And then we're left with this reality that I described earlier, where we have one state over the entire country with two nations in it. It's a binational state, but has exclusive rights for Jewish people. It's not a Jewish state because half the population is not Jewish. It's not a democracy because the non-Jewish population doesn't count. In fact, it's a state that has different laws for different people. That's why people often compare it to apartheid. In fact, the notion and the principle of apartheid, of separation, hafradah, was coined very early on by the Zionist leadership. So you've got the laws that govern the lives of people like myself. I have a VIP card. I'm an Israeli Jew. It's a democracy. I come, I go, I can do whatever I like. I can get a job. I can buy a house. I can speak my mind. Of course, nobody listens, but I can say what I like. They're the laws that govern the lives of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. There's about 1.5 million or so of those. And there are dozens of laws in the law books that specifically discriminate against the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, the non-Jewish population. And if you go to adala.org, you'll be able to see all those laws online. But it's more than just the laws, it's an environment of discrimination and racism. If you think about the South during Jim Crow, you didn't need the laws in order for the racism and discrimination to exist. The laws just made it official. The neglect, the oppression of Palestinian communities within Israel is quite often worse than it is in some places in the West Bank and Gaza. You will be hard-pressed to find a single dollar invested or a single permit ever given to build anything inside Palestinian communities, inside what was the state of Israel, in other words, for Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And then you have the laws that govern the West Bank and Gaza. People live in the West Bank and Gaza, and there are no laws that protect them. They're at the mercy of the Israeli military, and it's a military that does not show mercy to Palestinians. Their homes can be destroyed, their children can be arrested and tortured, they can be arrested and tortured for as long as some commander wants to keep them in jail. They will be killed, they will be shot, bombs will be dropped upon them from the sky. There is no law. They live at the mercy of what I would categorize today as probably one of the best financed and best armed terrorist organizations in the world. That's the Israeli military, that's the Israeli army. Certainly they have commanders and they have uniforms, they look all respectable, and they have F-16s and tanks and so on, but they're nothing more than a glorified terrorist organization dedicated to terrorizing an entire population. And there's an entire bureaucracy that is dedicated to passing laws and making life impossible for Palestinians to live. So anybody who supports the state of Israel needs to understand it's a package deal. There is no kinder, gentler aspect of the state of Israel. This is the state of Israel. It's the only way you can have a Jewish state in an Arab country where half the population is not Jewish. That's the only way. Racist laws, political prisoners, and violence. That's it. There's no other way to maintain that. But there is another way. There is another possibility, and again, this has nothing to do with politics, it has everything to do with our values. Some people think it's okay and you can justify dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on a civilian population. That's one set of values. Another set of values says that every life is sacred, that all people deserve the same amount of water, for example. that the rights of people, the respecting their human rights and their civil rights, shouldn't make a difference whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. Everybody's rights should be respected. That if one government governs an entire country, then everybody within that country deserves equal rights under the law, and equal opportunities, and equal access to the resources, particularly water. Palestinians get about 1/10 of the water that Israelis get, about. Sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on where they live. So there is another possibility, and that is the end of the Jewish state, the end of the Zionist state, in favor of a real democracy. So, of course, the first thing that comes up is, well, you're talking about another Holocaust. You want to kill all the Jews. Nobody talks about violence. Nobody talks about killing anyone. The process that we talk about is including everyone. It's a process of inclusion, including everyone in the political process, allowing everybody to prosper, allowing everyone who lives in that country to enjoy the country and to enjoy it equally. Well, people will say it's a utopian. It's impossible. But that's what they said about the end of apartheid in South Africa. That's what they said about the Berlin Wall. That's what they said about dictatorships in Latin America. And almost all of those were transformed without violence. The chances for success for a productive, functioning democracy with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians is far greater than any of the other things that I just mentioned. Israelis and Palestinians are very similar societies. Both are very highly educated. Both have traditions of democracy. Both have corrupt leadership that they want to get rid of. They're very similar. And both of them are made up of mostly people in the middle class people, who are neither fanatic nor rich and corrupt, but want to get up in the morning, send their kids to school, and go to work, and want lower taxes and better roads. Most of us are right there in that middle area. So the chances of success are fantastic. But people have to get over this idea that there needs to be this racist Zionist Jewish state. Supporting a Zionist Jewish state in Palestine is a racist idea. And like I said, it's a question of values. If we support democracy, if we believe in human rights, if we believe in civil rights, which I hope we do, then there is only one path, and that is working and participating in what I would call this global intifada, which calls for the creation of a real democracy that will afford freedom and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you all very much. I do.
Does anyone have questions?
We'll do 3 at a time, okay? I'll write them down and then I'll reply.
Sir, you overstate your case. It's certainly true, and you know very well, that Israel doesn't have exclusive rights for the Jews. 1.5 million Palestinians living inside Israel can go to the polls and vote. Since day one, they haven't needed to have a process like we have in this country for our minorities and our women to get the right to vote. Sir, you know very well that all of those Palestinians, and since day one of 1948, when Israel created a democracy, there have always been Palestinians and Arabs in that democracy, and they all go to the polls and they all vote. You overstate your case, and I am wondering what else you are telling this audience is that is an overstatement of your case and not the real truth. Really, not the truth. Please be fair to this audience and tell the truth.
That was an astounding applause.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit more about the U.S.'s foreign aid and that they're giving to Israel, and if the U.S. was to cut that aid off, how would the negotiating situation change? Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. I just want to ask, like, what are the interests of the United States in Israel? Because I feel like uh, in the United Nations, like most international, like most countries, kind of support like the Palestinian cause, but the United States has been like vetoing United Nations resolutions which are in favor of Palestinian. And my question is like, what is the interest of United States in Israel?
Good question. All right, thank you. Well, I would have to say I am telling the truth. The fact that Palestinians can vote does not make Israel a democracy. The fact that a certain percentage of the Palestinians that are governed by Israel have the right to vote doesn't make it a democracy. And from day one, the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens for the first 20 years of the State of Israel were living under an oppressive military rule. You may or may not have heard that. And the fact that they can vote, again, doesn't give them any political power, because the way the Knesset and the Israeli political system is structured, it is structured in a way to eliminate from Palestinians to have any political power. So they are always excluded from major decisions, they're always excluded from major votes, or they're never counted in major votes, so that when coalitions are created, people always take into account that their vote is not important, is irrelevant. So Israel has created a very sophisticated structure that on the one hand can give people the right to vote, but on the other hand makes sure that their vote is useless. So that is the reality. And again, you can call Israel a democracy if you want. It is a democracy for Israeli Jews. It's not a democracy for the other half of the population. In terms of the foreign aid, it's interesting because Americans give Israel some, I don't know, $3-4 billion a year in foreign aid, and then there's a few more $1 billion that are given through charities and all kinds of not-for-profits and tax exempt and so forth. Now, Israel is a country that doesn't need foreign aid. The Israelis conquered the entire country, defeated Arab armies several times, and won 3 wars before the foreign aid began. So it never needed the foreign aid. So you have to wonder, why are Americans, taxpayers, giving Israel $10-12 million a day when it's a fully developed country? If you're going to give foreign aid, why not give it to a poor country, a country that's struggling, a country that needs it? But that's one question. So, but it relates to your question in that if the foreign aid stopped, would it really make that much of a difference? Politically, it would have an effect, but some effect. Perhaps it would be a way for America to yield some influence on the State of Israel. But I think 10 years ago or so, the Israeli defense budget was about $30 billion. So they get $3 billion from the United States. So it's not earth-shattering. And again, it's a country that doesn't need aid. I think it would be a welcome step and a step in the right direction. There's no question about that. I would even say that there would be something even more effective that American politicians can do would be to demand that Israel release all political prisoners. That Israel, as a first step, lift the siege on Gaza. These are things that they can do, within a week, within a month maybe. It can be done. It's not that hard. Israel just needs to decide to do it. It's not going to have any negative ramifications. And if an American politician said that, besides probably losing the next election, they would create some real discussion, some real debate. But of course, the reality in America is that can't happen, let alone suggesting ending the foreign aid. Now, a great deal of the foreign aid comes back here in the way of arms sales. So a lot of those billions come back here so that Israel can buy arms, which again, it doesn't need, because it was doing fine before it got those arms as well. So it's this vicious circle that makes no sense to anyone, but profits a few people and allows this very racist, non-democratic state to continue its presence and its very, very dangerous presence in the Middle East. And this connects, and this relates also to the third question about U.S. interests. There's this myth out there that somehow America has to have a Jewish state in the Middle East because that is how we protect our interests. I don't know why that's true. Why does America need a Jewish state in the Middle East? It's already got Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. that are allies. And let's say that it wasn't a Jewish state. Let's say that the state was a Palestinian state. Would they align with somebody else? Would they align with China? Everybody wants to align with the U.S. today. So I don't know why but there is this myth out there that, American interests are at stake. Israel is our only reliable ally in the Middle East. That's why we must have the state of Israel there. I don't know why that's true. I don't know how that's true. I think American commanders, particularly during Iraq and after the war in Iraq, made it absolutely clear that Israel was a liability from every perspective. But it's a myth that's out there, and it's one of those myths that's created when you have a very effective lobby. Israel has a very effective lobby in America. It's called AIPAC. And it's not a Jewish lobby. It's an Israeli lobby. It's an important distinction. It doesn't do anything for Jewish people, but it promotes a very narrow agenda, the Zionist agenda. And one of the things that they were able to do, because they've had decades of experience and they've been involved in this process and they're very good at what they do, they were able to create this myth that America actually needs Israel, that there has to be a Jewish state there for for Americans to feel safe. Again, it's one of those myths that's completely baffling. And when you look at the region, I think it proves itself to be untrue. So I don't think America has any interest. But because there's a strong lobby, American politicians behave the way they do, and and votes in the United Nations and votes in Congress and so forth always fall on the pro-Israeli side because that's what Americans feel they have to support. But it's all based on a myth. It's really all based on a lie. And I think one of the important things that is actually happening in America now is more and more people are realizing this. They're realizing that they're throwing $3-4 billion into the air every year, and that they're wasting their political capital around the world by supporting the state of Israel. And more Americans are getting sick and tired of it, which I think is a good thing. Do you have any more?
I saw the movie The Gatekeepers, and I thought that it represented a possible cracking of the Israeli superstructure of public relations in this country. But I understand that you had a different view of it, that you considered it Israeli propaganda, and I wonder if you could explain that. It completely baffles me.
Okay.
I wonder if you read the article in the October, I think it was 21st New Yorker by an Israeli about one of the Palestinian towns that was wiped out in the 60s. I'm sorry, I did not bring the magazine with me, so I can't give you the exact title, but it was a very interesting point of view from...
I didn't read it, but I heard about it. I'm trying to think. Well, what's your question?
If you were familiar with it, and what was your response to it?
No, I can't say I didn't read it.
I would like to know the extent to which stories like about your niece's death and the response of her parents and other situations like that are publicized. And also, since you, even given your family's national history in the new Jewish state, are there others like yourself, in any numbers, coming to the same kind of conclusion as you? In other words, are there thinking people who also are proudly Jewish?
Getting a good workout. Good bright tennis shoes.
I was hoping that you could broaden my limited knowledge on the treatment of Beta Israelis or the Ethiopian Jews and how they fit in the national narrative and how their treatment differs or strikes similarities with African refugees of late.
That's a topic for a whole other lecture. Yeah, the gatekeepers. Often people think, a lot of people saw the gatekeepers, and I remember the initial responses were, wow, can you believe this is coming out? And it's such a sign of hope. And I remember on CNN, they were interviewing the guy who made the movie, and they asked him, do you think Bibi Netanyahu is going to watch this? And so I went to see it, and all I saw were 5 men who deserve to be in jail for their horrific, horrific crimes. These 5 men headed one of the most criminal organizations. It's the Shabak. It's the Israeli, it's called ISA, Israeli Secret Intelligence. It's the Israeli Secret Police, basically. It's the internal intelligence agency. It's not the Mossad, which is the external, but it's internal. They committed horrific crimes. They admitted to their crimes, and they were made to look like heroes. They were made to look like people who actually fought terrorism. And the minute they said, or as soon as they said the word terrorism, you knew that they were fake and phony, because anybody who calls Palestinian resistance terrorism is a liar. And so they were placed up there, pretending that somehow they had nothing to do with the occupation, that really all they always wanted was peace. But they were forced into the situation where they actually had to fight terrorism their whole lives. And then they would describe horrific scenes of torture, horrific scenes where a father calls his son and the phone blows his head off. And one of the remarks were, God, I love that. That was a wonderfully clean operation. And you have to wonder, these men who headed this criminal organization are being publicized. You'd almost think not only that it's a propaganda movie, but that they're preparing for their defense once they are brought to justice. It is an Israeli propaganda movie, and it's very similar to what organizations like J Street are trying to do, which is to portray this more democratic, kind of more liberal, less racist state of Israel, as though there's a possibility for that, and it actually maybe even exists. And here we are, we have these heroes who really always wanted peace, and they're admitting to some of their crimes, and they're saying how terrible it was. They didn't say how terrible it was when they were in office. They executed those things. They executed those policies. They committed horrific crimes against an innocent population that was resisting a terrible oppression. And they all need to sit in the defendant's chair at The Hague, not be paraded here as some heroes. And if you listen to the very words that they say, if you historically look at how they react to some of the what they call operations. I remember one of them talking about this particular form of torture called shaking. And I guess it was developed under his leadership. And he said, it doesn't hurt them. It doesn't do anything, but it gets them to talk. Well, I have a good Palestinian friend who was in a coma for 48 hours as a result of the shaking, and still today, some 20 years later, has headaches and migraines from the shaking. An innocent man, by the way. So not only, I think, is it an Israeli propaganda film, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're already thinking of the day that somebody's going to say, you guys have committed crimes, and they will be able to say, yes, but look, we came out and we said all this. And it goes back I talk about this in my book. Several years ago, the Shabak, the same organization, their head interrogator went out to retirement. So there was a big story about him in the Israeli paper. And once again, instead of jumping on the opportunity and pressing charges against that criminal for the things that he did, he was paraded as a hero. He said, yes, there were some terrible things done. But what are you going to do? We have to deal with terrorism. It's such a justification of their criminality that it is appalling. And it is a sign, people talk about Israeli society, and Israeli society being a democratic society, a society that tolerates people like that. This was in the news. This was in a major newspaper. He admitted to torturing people. He admitted to doing horrific acts. And not a single voice was heard, not a single voice called for his arrest and for charges to be pressed. And the same thing with this new movie with the gatekeepers. So this is part of this, and I think once again it's quite characteristic of Israeli society to try to portray themselves as peace-loving on the one hand, yet commit all these horrific crimes on the other. The story of my niece and her mother's and father's reaction was very well publicized. Very well publicized. I don't think there was a major newspaper in the world or a TV station that didn't interview them. And still to this day, I mean, they're interviewed, the works are published, articles and so forth. And you're asking if there are others. You know, when you started asking the question, are there Irish like myself, I was actually pretty optimistic. Thinking people, I thought, wow, great. Then when you said Jewish is when I thought, oh boy. There are lots of people who talk about the need for a single democracy. Many Jewish people talk about it. Ilan Pape, who's a well-known historian, has been talking about it for years, and others. Many Palestinians, countless Palestinians in the West Bank and inside, Israeli citizens and everywhere, a lot of other places talk about it. This is a, like I said, the prospect of success is so high that the thinking people see this as the only game in town. It's really the only solution if we share the values of democracy, human rights, and civil rights. It's really the only thing that's out there. There is no other possibility. So there are many people who view this, sadly not enough Israelis, or I would say marginally small group of Israelis think this way and talk about this. But Israel as a society still is bound by the parameters that are placed by the Zionist narrative. So as long as you maintain the conversation within the Zionist narrative, you're okay. The further left you go, or the further pro-Palestinian you go, the more dangerous it is. But if you take that leap and go beyond the Zionist parameters and talk about the crimes of Zionism and the need to abolish Zionism and create a real democracy, nobody wants to hear. Nobody wants to talk, nobody wants to hear. But again, I don't think that's a problem, because I don't think whites in South Africa were keen on seeing the end of apartheid. And I don't think whites here in the southern states in the United States were keen to see, Jim Crow go. But one day they woke up in the morning and it was a different world, and they had to deal with it. And if they don't like it, they can leave, and the ones that stay will see that the sky's not going to fall. And there may well be a day sooner than most of us think, I would argue, where there will be a Palestinian prime minister governing that entire country. And that's going to be the reality. There's going to be a Palestinian majority very soon. And when there are equal rights and people go to the polls, people are going to vote. And I don't think it's a bad thing. People talk about, the demographic changes as though it's some kind of a danger. They call it a demographic threat. I mean, can you imagine a more racist thing to say? As though having Palestinians around us is somehow a bad thing. It's a dangerous thing. I mean, look at them. It's this absurd notion. It's this absurd, mythology of fear, which when you, once again, you look at it in detail, you see that it's nothing more than a mythology and a lie. So I don't think Israelis are going to be consulted one way or the other. There's going to be a reality, and they're going to wake up one morning, and that's going to be it. And I think they're going to be fine. This democracy is better for everyone. Being the oppressor makes you sick. Israeli society in many ways is sick. I mean, when you drive along the wall on the Israeli side, it's very pretty. It's decorated, it's got flowers, it's got all kinds of beautiful signs. You still see the towers from time to time. So there's something of a concentration camp on the other side. But mostly it's very pretty. But there's still a wall there. And if there's a wall there, and our sons have to go into the military and go in there where they're fully armed all the time, and crossing those checkpoints, you have these big warning signs, there's got to be something very bad and dangerous on the other side. And living your whole life thinking there's something horrible on the other side is very bad for you. And to keep maintaining this fear and militarization as a society is a very bad thing. So I think this would be better. There's no question in my mind that this is going to be liberating for not only Palestinians, but for Israelis as well. And eventually they'll realize, like I said, that it's better for them as well. The Ethiopian Jews and the racism against the African refugees is, like I said, it's a topic for a whole other, it's an excellent question, but it's a topic for a whole other lecture. I will say that racism is racism. And when you have in place a racist regime, it's going to behave like a racist regime. We won't get into the details of how and why the Ethiopians were brought and what happened to them after they were brought and how they're treated. But there's no question that they are facing horrific racism. And the same thing with the refugees, who at first Israel heralded itself and said, look at us, we're saving all these refugees, and 5 minutes later there are pogroms against them, their houses are being burned, and there's a demand to send them back. So Israel likes to play both sides of this issue. But the bottom line is that racism is racism. And if you're racist against one person, you're probably racist against everybody else who's not you. And that's exactly what you see, in this mania that's taking place in Israel in regards to the Africans is insane. But that's what it is. It's a symptom of a racist society. Anyway, I don't want to end up with a sad note, so I'm going to say one more thing before I finish, and that is this. Supporting the Palestinian cause is the right thing to do. Supporting the Palestinian cause is exactly what you want to tell your kids, that you supported this cause, your kids and your grandkids, when this is over. Sadly, like I said, people who come down on supporting the state of Israel will either deny it. I think today, if you talk to people in America, you're not going to find a single politician that will admit that they were against fighting apartheid, that they supported apartheid in South Africa. Similarly, 10, 20 years ago, if you traveled in Germany, I'm sure you wouldn't have found a single Nazi. People tend to forget these things, the small details, who they supported and why. But I think when this thing is over, it's going to be very hard to find people who actually supported the state of Israel. They will deny it, or hopefully they will be shamed to admitting it, because our children and grandchildren are going to ask these questions. And I think it's important to remember who these people are. Because whenever there's a vigil to remember the countless that were killed in Gaza, whether it's Castellet or other operations, and whenever there's a vigil to remember the Nakba that began in 1948 and the horrific acts of terrorism that were perpetuated by Israel against the Palestinians, and on the other side, you see the pro-Israeli groups wrapping themselves in the Israeli flag and dancing around, remember who these people were. Because when they try to deny that they did this, it'll be very important to remind them that they didn't. And then my hat's off to the student organizations, to civil organizations that all put this event together in their support. And I would say clearly, the way forward is to get behind the banner of a real democracy with equal rights and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians, so that they do have a bright future. Thank you all very much. Yes, I'll sign books. Yeah, I'll be right up. He's an old man, but he's still active. He's still there. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I remember you. Sure. Thank you.
Born in Jerusalem, kicked out